Medieval England wasn't a fairy tale filled with knights in shining armor and grand castles. It was more like a survival horror game, and spoiler alert, you wouldn't last past breakfast. Forget about plumbing, hospitals, or anything resembling human rights. Disease was everywhere. Food could, and would, kill you. The law was brutal. Medicine? Let's just say it was better to avoid doctors altogether. Stick around, and we'll show you why you'd be tapping out in less than 24 hours. You wake up in your one-room cottage, if you're lucky enough to have one. The smell hits first. A pungent blend of sweat, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something vaguely sewer-like. That's because, well, it is sewer-like. There's no indoor plumbing, no sewage system, no garbage pickup. Waste flows into the street, or, if you're in the countryside, piles up in your backyard. Morning breath? Forget it. Brushing teeth hasn't been invented yet. Bathing? Not a daily ritual, not even a monthly one. Most people bathed once or twice a year, if that. Water was precious and often dirty, so wasting it on a bath seemed foolish. Besides, most thought bathing too often made you sick. Soap was a luxury. Few could afford, and even if you had it, it wasn't the luxurious, fragrant kind we know today. It was made from animal fat and ash, rough and often irritating to the skin. Your clothes haven't been washed in months either. Laundry is backbreaking labor, and most people only owned 1 or 2 sets of clothing, usually made of coarse wool or linen. Changing into clean clothes? Not a thing. You just wore what you had until it fell apart or got too infested with lice to tolerate. And believe me, you will have lice. Head lice, body lice, and even fleas are your constant companions. Good luck sleeping. And speaking of sleeping, your bed isn't much better. If you even have a bed, it's a rough straw mattress, likely crawling with bugs. Pillows? Maybe a sack of old rags if you're fortunate. There's no real concept of cleaning the house either. Dirt floors, smoky air from the fire pit, and vermin are just part of life. Mice, rats, and insects roam freely. You don't fight them, you just live with them. Dental hygiene? Laughable. Toothbrushes won't appear in Europe until the 17th century. In the meantime, your teeth rot. Cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss are common, even among the young. If a tooth hurts too much, the solution is simple. Rip it out. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just brute force and pain. By the time you're 30, assuming you even get that old, your mouth could look like a medieval graveyard, half empty and infected. And the streets outside? Absolute filth. In towns and cities, people toss their chamber pots, basically portable toilets, out of their windows. Streets double as open sewers, and they're often ankle-deep in mud, human waste, and rotting animal parts. You're trudging through a biohazard zone every day. If you fall or cut yourself, infection is almost guaranteed. Tetanus, sepsis. These aren't distant threats. They're lurking in every puddle and pile of muck. Even the water is dangerous. Wells are contaminated with waste, and the rivers, everyone's water source, are teeming with bacteria. Drinking water could easily give you dysentery, typhoid, or cholera. Most people drank ale or weak beer because it was safer than water. Alcohol at least killed some of the bacteria. Children drank beer. Pregnant women drank beer. Beer was survival, not recreation. Bodily smells. Totally normal. In fact, people expected each other to reek. Smelling clean was suspicious. You might be accused of vanity, or worse, witchcraft. Deodorant wasn't a thing, so people tried to mask the stench with strong herbs like lavender or rosemary tucked into their clothing. But really, it just added a new layer to the funk. Floral rot on top of sweaty decay. The few public baths that existed were communal and unsanitary. They were less about hygiene and more about socializing or, in many cases, illicit activities. And when the Black Death hit, public baths were often blamed for spreading disease. they shut down, and the little hygiene people did practice went right out the window. Dirt and filth became your permanent state of being. You think you could adjust to the smell eventually? Maybe. But the health problems would catch up with you fast. Skin infections were common, and not the easy-to-treat kind. Cuts and scrapes festered into oozing wounds. Leprosy, smallpox, and other skin diseases ran rampant. Scabies, mites burrowing under your skin, was normal. The itchiness, the sores, the secondary infections, all untreated, all miserable. If you lived in a castle or manor house, things weren't much better. Sure, you had stone walls instead of wood or mud, but they trapped smoke and moisture. Mold grew thick on the walls, and the heavy, damp air made respiratory diseases like pneumonia thrive. There were no glass windows to open, just wooden shutters or cloth, no air circulation, no light, perfect breeding grounds for sickness. You might think that winters offered a break from the stench. Wrong. Winters were even worse. With everyone huddled indoors, the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke and animal waste intensified. And you kept animals inside to protect them from thieves and predators. Cows, pigs, chickens, all sharing space with you, all adding their lovely contributions to the indoor aroma. Oh, and there's no toilet paper. Instead, people wiped with straw, moss, or even bare hands. Washing hands wasn't a habit. In fact, it was considered unnecessary unless you were particularly fussy. Germ theory. Hundreds of years away. People didn't even understand that filth caused disease. They believed illness came from bad air or divine punishment. Washing your hands after, say, gutting a pig or delivering a baby? Not even on the radar. You might try to escape to the countryside, thinking rural life is cleaner. Nope. Farms were cesspools of mud, manure, and rotting vegetation. Flies blanketed everything. Pigs rooted in garbage heaps. Chickens pecked at dung piles, and rats, disease-spreading rats, flourished. You couldn't run away from the filth. It was everywhere, inescapable, baked into the fabric of daily life. And let's not forget about body lice. These tiny parasites burrowed into your clothes and skin, spreading typhus and causing constant itching and sores. A lice infestation wasn't unusual. It was inevitable. People developed techniques for dealing with lice, like sewing the seams of their clothing shut to trap them or wearing amulets. But mostly they just itched and scratched and suffered. Sweating, also an issue. In the summer, heat and lack of bathing turned everyone into mobile swamps. Dehydration and heat stroke weren't uncommon, especially during labor-intensive work like farming or building. But no one was reaching for a Gatorade. Water was still risky, and you just soldiered on through the misery. Even your hair wasn't safe. Lice lived in it, yes, but so did fleas and sometimes even maggots if scalp infections set in. Barbers doubled as surgeons, and getting your head shaved was considered a health measure. The bald look wasn't a style choice. It was a survival tactic to avoid infestation and disease. Still, it didn't work all the time. Religious orders, monks and nuns, were among the cleanest people around because they believed cleanliness was next to godliness. Monasteries often had rudimentary plumbing and hand-washing stations. But even then, hygiene was far from modern standards, and unless you planned on taking vows and dedicating your life to prayer and hard labor, you weren't getting in. So what happens if you get sick? Besides the bad water, lice, and constant injuries, you're also vulnerable to plagues, dysentery, tuberculosis, and the dreaded sweating sickness, all of which thrive in filthy, crowded conditions. Medical treatment was primitive, but worse, people believed disease was caused by sin or evil spirits. That meant prayer, not medicine, was your best bet. Living in medieval England wasn't just dirty. It was a health hazard on every level. Your body would rebel against the filth within days. Rashes, infections, respiratory issues, parasites. They'd pile up quickly. Hygiene wasn't just bad, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. And unless you had the immune system of a superhero, you wouldn't last long. Assuming you've survived the filth of your surroundings, congratulations. Now it's time to starve. Your diet in medieval England wasn't about variety, balance, or taste. It was about survival, and even that was a gamble. If you're imagining hearty feasts with roasted meats and fresh bread, forget it. For the average person, a peasant, which is what you almost certainly would have been, food was monotonous, bland, and barely enough to keep you alive. Your morning would likely start with pottage, a thick, bland stew made from whatever grains, legumes, or vegetables were available. It was reheated day after day until it turned into something more resembling wallpaper paste. Meat, rare. Most peasants ate meat only on special occasions, if at all. When they did manage to get their hands on some, it was usually salted, dried, or otherwise preserved to last through the long winters, and not always successfully. Fresh fruits and vegetables? Only if they were in season and you were lucky. Vitamin C deficiency, otherwise known as scurvy, wasn't limited to sailors. It hit land dwellers too. Without a steady supply of fresh produce, malnutrition was a constant threat. You might develop rickets from a lack of vitamin D or suffer from pellagra thanks to a deficiency in niacin. Your body would slowly fall apart, but hey, at least the bread was plentiful. Except the bread wasn't great either. Medieval bread, especially for peasants, was made with coarse barley, rye, or oats. Wheat was reserved for the rich. It was dense, heavy, and often filled with whatever filler was on hand: ground peas, beans, even straw or sawdust. Sometimes it was so badly made that it contained ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on rye and caused hallucinations, seizures, and even death. You didn't just eat to live, you gambled. Let's talk about water. You might think clean, fresh water would be a basic need. Not in medieval England. Most water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste. Drinking it was a shortcut to diarrhea, dysentery, or typhoid fever. That's why even children drank ale, a weak, low-alcohol brew that was safer than water. It wasn't delicious, but it wouldn't kill you quite as quickly as the well water would. Pregnant? Still beer. Sick? Beer again. You might dream of a nice slab of beef or a juicy chicken leg, but livestock was valuable and rarely slaughtered for food. Animals were more useful alive, providing milk, eggs, wool, or labor. If you did get meat, it was likely heavily salted to preserve it, and you'd have to soak it or cook it for hours to make it edible. Spoilage was common, especially in summer. No refrigeration meant eating borderline rotten meat was a gamble many had to take. Cheese and butter were available if you were lucky enough to own livestock. But they were often made under less than hygienic conditions. Cheese could be infested with maggots, butter could go rancid quickly, and since salt was expensive, preserving dairy was difficult. Most people just hoped they could consume it before it turned. Spoiled dairy didn't just taste bad, it could cause food poisoning, something that could easily become fatal without modern medicine. And forget about a balanced diet. Carbs dominated every meal, with little protein and almost no fat unless you were wealthy. Peasants lived mostly on bread, pottage and ale, supplemented by whatever they could forage, berries, nuts or roots. Hunting was illegal for commoners. On noble land, and getting caught poaching could mean a harsh punishment, even death. So unless you wanted to risk everything for a rabbit, you stuck with what little you could legally gather. Salt was a luxury. It preserved food and made it taste better, but it was so expensive that most peasants couldn't afford much. Spices. Out of the question. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, all imported and costly, reserved for the tables of nobility. Your food was bland, often tasteless, and sometimes actively disgusting. The idea of enjoying a meal was a foreign concept for most people. Eating was a chore, a necessity, not a pleasure. If you lived near the coast or a river, fish was a major part of your diet. But even that wasn't simple. Fishing rights were controlled by landowners, and most fish were dried, salted, or smoked to preserve them. Fresh fish was rare and usually saved for religious holidays. And like meat, it could spoil easily. Eating spoiled fish could lead to food poisoning, and without understanding bacteria, people often had no idea their food was unsafe until it was too late. Portions were small too. A big, hearty meal was not the norm. Most people lived in a constant state of semi-starvation, especially during winter and early spring when stores ran out and new crops hadn't yet grown. This period, called the Hungry Gap, was a terrifying annual event. You rationed your last bits of grain and dried beans, hoping to survive until the next harvest. Malnutrition-related diseases flared up during this time, making people even weaker and more vulnerable to illness. Special occasions like feast days or weddings offered a rare chance at decent food. Villages would slaughter animals and bake special breads or pies, but these were rare, maybe a few times a year, and didn't make up for the months of near starvation. Plus, even feast days were risky. Improperly cooked meat, contaminated water used in food preparation, and general poor hygiene could easily lead to outbreaks of foodborne illness that wiped out entire villages. If you were rich, things were better, but not by modern standards. Nobles dined on a greater variety of foods, including meats, spices, and sweets. But they also suffered from a lack of nutritional balance. Their diets were heavy in meat and low in fiber, leading to digestive problems like gout and constipation, and they weren't immune to food poisoning either. Fancy dishes like meat pies and custards were breeding grounds for bacteria in an era with no refrigeration. The idea of a kitchen garden did exist. Herbs like sage, thyme, and parsley were grown to flavor food and for medicinal purposes. But again, only the relatively well-off had access to such luxuries. Most peasants barely scraped by, dependent on the meager crops they could grow or the occasional surplus from a lord's land. Crop failures due to bad weather, pests, or disease could, and did, cause mass starvation. Famine wasn't a rare disaster. It was a recurring nightmare. You might try to get clever, gathering wild plants to supplement your diet. But identifying safe plants without dying from poisonous ones was tricky. Mistakes were common. Some plants looked harmless, but were deadly. Mushrooms could kill you. Even seemingly innocent plants like hemlock or nightshade could be fatal. Foraging was a skill passed down by word of mouth. One wrong guess, and you'd end up another unrecorded statistic in the brutal ledger of medieval life. Food preparation didn't help matters. Kitchens were smoky, filthy places. Pots were rarely scrubbed. Knives were used on everything from meat to dung-caked vegetables without washing in between. Cross-contamination was a fact of life, though no one knew what it was. Vermin infested grain stores, and people often unwittingly consumed rat droppings or insect larvae with their meals. Meals weren't just unsafe. They were minefields of potential infections and parasites. And if you got sick from the food, there was no real medical help. Vomiting and diarrhea could quickly lead to dehydration and death. Remedies were few and often involved bloodletting or bizarre herbal concoctions that didn't actually work. Some treatments were downright dangerous. Eating food wasn't just a risk. It was a gamble with your life every single day. And it's a gamble most medieval peasants lost before reaching what we'd now consider middle age. Even the cultural attitudes toward food reflected scarcity. Waste was considered a sin. Every scrap of food was used. Animal organs, bone marrow, even blood. Nothing was thrown away. Stale bread was soaked and eaten. Bones were boiled for days to extract the last bit of nutrition. Hunger was a constant companion, and for many, the fear of running out of food was as persistent as the hunger pangs themselves. So picture this. A cold, smoky cottage, a bowl of lukewarm, gritty pottage, a hunk of hard, dense bread, and a mug of weak ale. That's your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No snacks, no variety. Just the same thing, day after day if you're lucky. Food isn't pleasure, it's survival. And most of the time, you're just barely winning that battle. One bad harvest, one spoiled loaf, one tainted mug of ale, and you're done. Your modern stomach, used to clean water, fresh produce, balanced nutrition, and strict food safety laws, wouldn't stand a chance. Within days, you'd be writhing, with cramps, dehydrated, and weak from nutrient deficiencies. And even if you survive the initial shock to your system, the long-term effects of medieval malnutrition, rickets, scurvy, anemia, would slowly and painfully take you down. Eating in medieval England wasn't living, it was enduring. So you've managed to stay alive despite the filth and starvation. Great. Now you have to survive the laws. And believe me, medieval England's legal system wasn't built for mercy. If you think modern courts are slow and unfair, wait until you meet a system where guilt was determined by superstition, torture, and public humiliation. And where punishments were not only brutal, but designed to be spectacles. First off, understand this. There was no police force. No detectives, no officers, no one walking a beat looking out for your well-being. Law enforcement was basically a DIY operation. If someone committed a crime, it was the duty of the local community, often the victim's neighbors, to catch them. If the criminal fled, the village would raise a hue and cry, literally shouting and chasing after them, hoping to drag them back for trial. The trials themselves weren't about evidence. They were about appearances, oaths, and divine judgment. Accused of theft? You might be asked to find a dozen people to swear you were innocent. Good luck with that if you're new in town or not popular. No witnesses? No problem. You could undergo a trial by ordeal. Common methods included plunging your arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your arm healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it didn't, guilty. Another popular ordeal was trial by water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent in the eyes of God. If you floated, you were guilty and faced punishment. Either way, you lost. And these weren't just rare, bizarre exceptions. They were standard operating procedure for centuries. Even more civilized trials were terrifyingly biased and had little room for actual defense. Let's say you're found guilty. What happens next? Fines were common if you could afford them, but most people couldn't. For serious crimes like theft, arson, or murder, you could expect harsher penalties. Hanging was the standard punishment for many crimes, but it wasn't quick or painless. Executions were often botched, with prisoners slowly strangling to death on a poorly tied noose. Public executions were entertainment, a grim afternoon out for the whole family. Thieves could also face mutilation, losing a hand, foot, or even an ear. Branding was another popular choice, marking criminals permanently with hot irons so everyone would know what you did. Gossip too much? You could find yourself in the stocks, locked into a wooden frame in the town square where passers-by could throw rotten food, rocks, or worse at you. Public shaming wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged as a deterrent. For women, punishments had their own flavor of cruelty. Accused of gossiping or being a scold, you might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal mask with an iron bit inserted into your mouth to prevent you from speaking. Or worse, you could be subjected to ducking, tied to a chair, and dunked repeatedly into a pond or river until you either repented or drowned. Justice wasn't blind. It was brutal and public. Debtors had it bad too. Owe money and fail to pay it back? You could end up in a debtor's prison, filthy, disease-ridden, and often a death sentence. If you had family who could pay your debts, you might get out. If not, you rotted away behind bars. There was no rehabilitation, no second chances. The system was designed to punish, not reform. Mercy was rare, and survival was a miracle. Even accusations without proof could destroy you. Say someone accused you of witchcraft, a common occurrence, especially if you were an older woman or a social outcast. Evidence wasn't needed. Suspicion alone could ruin your life. Trials for witches often involved impossible tasks, like reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly under stress. Any mistake, any stammer, was seen as proof of guilt. Torture wasn't officially sanctioned, but persuasion methods were common. Torture devices like the rack, thumbscrews, and the Iron Maiden are famous, but less exotic tortures were more common. Starvation, beatings, sleep deprivation. Jails themselves were torture chambers, dark, damp, rat-infested pits where disease spread faster than rumors. Prisoners weren't fed by the jailers, they relied on friends or family to bring food. If no one cared enough to help you, you simply starved to death. And don't expect fairness. The legal system favored the wealthy and powerful. If you were rich, you could pay for oaths, bribes, or better accommodations. Poor, you were on your own. Trials could be over in a matter of minutes, and appeals. Forget about it. Even a small crime could spiral into a death sentence simply because you couldn't afford a good word from the right person. If you managed to get sentenced to something short of death, transportation was another lovely option. Convicts could be sent overseas, to colonies or distant territories, for years or life. Conditions during transportation were hellish, packed into ships like cattle, disease rampant, survival not guaranteed. And if you survived the voyage, congratulations, you were now an indentured servant, working yourself to death in an unfamiliar land, and for the crimes that really upset the powers that be, treason, rebellion, or speaking ill of the king, the punishments became creative. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was a special delight reserved for traitors. You'd be hanged until near death, disemboweled while still alive, and then your body would be chopped into pieces and displayed. Publicly as a warning, it was messy, horrifying, and all too real. Public punishments weren't just about justice, they were about sending a message. Gallows were often placed in central locations, stocks were set up in marketplaces, and executions were timed to coincide, with market days for maximum audience. Children watched, vendors sold food, and people cheered or jeered. Violence wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. Pain wasn't private. It was the backbone of the justice system. And even if you weren't directly in trouble, you weren't safe. Collective punishment was common. If someone in your village committed a crime, the whole village could be fined or punished. Collective responsibility kept people on edge and neighbors suspicious of one another. This bred an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. Trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal was common. Religious courts were no better. Blasphemy, heresy, or simply having the wrong opinions could get you excommunicated. A death sentence in its own right, since being cast out of the church, often meant social and economic ruin. Heretics could be burned at the stake, a slow and agonizing death. Refuse to confess? Torture? Recant your beliefs? Maybe they'd strangle you before lighting the fire. But only maybe. And let's not forget about corporal punishment for minor infractions. Children were beaten regularly as discipline, and so were adults. Whipping posts stood in many towns, and public flogging was a standard punishment for everything from petty theft to drunkenness. 10, 20, even 50 lashes were common. No antibiotics, no antiseptic, just raw, open wounds exposed to dirt, sweat, and infection. The punishments weren't just physical. They were psychological, public shaming, branding, mutilation. They marked you for life. Once labeled a criminal, your chances of finding work, marrying, or regaining any social standing were slim to none. Stigma followed you everywhere, and many chose to leave their homes entirely, wandering as beggars or thieves, which ironically often led to even harsher punishments if they were caught again. Justice in medieval England wasn't about fairness or rehabilitation. It was about control, it was about fear, and it was about survival. Not for you, but for the system that needed visible examples of what happened when you stepped out of line. One false accusation, one petty crime, one unlucky day, and you could find yourself dangling from the gallows or rotting in a pit, with no one to mourn you and no one to save you. Even if you lived a perfectly honest life, accidents happened. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be fatal. Market brawls, drunken fights, mistaken identity, all could end with your life destroyed by a system that cared more about maintaining order than about right or wrong. Surviving medieval England wasn't just about avoiding disease or starvation. It was about staying invisible and praying that justice didn't notice you. And that's the cruelest irony of all. The very thing that was supposed to protect you, the law, was just another threat you had to survive. In a world where pain was public and mercy was rare, justice was just another roll of the dice. And like everything else in medieval England, the house always won. If you think you can hustle your way to a better life in medieval England, think again. The class you were born into was the class you died in. End of story. Upward mobility wasn't a thing. No matter how clever, hard-working, or lucky you were, the odds were stacked against you. Medieval society was a rigid hierarchy with invisible walls you couldn't climb, no matter how much you scraped and bled. At the very bottom were the peasants, and chances are that's exactly where you'd land. Roughly 90% of the population were peasants, known as villeins or serfs. Villeins were technically free, but they owed labor to their lord in exchange for land to farm. Serfs, on the other hand, were bound to the land like human furniture. They couldn't leave, marry, or even pass down property without their lord's permission. Your day-to-day life as a peasant would be brutal. Imagine waking before dawn and working until dusk, 6 days a week, with Sunday as your only day off. And even then, it was spent in mandatory church services. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, maintaining tools, tending animals, fixing huts. Labor was endless and backbreaking. Seasons didn't matter. Summer brought heat stroke, winter brought frostbite. Spring and fall brought mud and disease. And for all this work, you didn't even own the food you grew. A huge portion went to your lord as rent, tithes to the church, and taxes to the king. What was left over was barely enough to feed your family. Starvation wasn't a risk, it was a regular feature of life. During bad harvest years, which happened often, you and your entire village might simply waste away, invisible to the lords and bishops, eating safely in their halls. Peasants lived in crude, one-room huts made of wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks and mud. Roofs were thatched, floors were dirt, and smoke from the central fire had nowhere to go but up and out a small hole in the roof. Families, sometimes with livestock in the same room, ate, slept, and survived together in these cramped, squalid conditions. Privacy, it didn't exist. Comfort, a rumor. Childhood didn't offer any respite. Kids weren't coddled. They were small workers in training. By the age of 7, you were expected to help in the fields, tend animals, and assist in the house. Education was a luxury reserved for the rich and the clergy. If you were lucky, you might learn some prayers in Latin, but reading, writing, and arithmetic? Forget it. Most people lived and died illiterate, their world no bigger than their village. And what about women? Double the misery. A peasant woman's life was an endless loop of childbirth, hard labor, and early death. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous. Without medical knowledge or sanitation, Many women didn't survive their first delivery. Those who did often spent their lives pregnant, a form of forced servitude to both their families and their overlords. Female peasants worked the fields alongside the men, then came home to cook, clean, and care for children. Moving up the social ladder was nearly impossible. The small landowning class, the yeomen, owned their own farms, but even they were subject to the whims of larger lords and could lose everything after a few bad harvests or a single war. Nobility, knights, barons, earls, were born into their privileges. Titles, land and wealth passed down through bloodlines. The idea of a peasant becoming a knight was pure fantasy. At the very top sat the king and high nobility. They owned vast swaths of land and the people on it. Their wealth came from taxes, rents, and the labor of the classes beneath them. Nobles lived in castles or manors, not exactly luxurious by modern standards, but a far cry from the huts peasants endured. They had meat, spices, furs, and occasionally clean clothing. They also had the luxury of time to learn, scheme, and fight wars. But even nobles weren't immune to the harsh realities of medieval life. Sure, they had food and better clothing, but they also faced dangers unique to their class. Warfare was constant, and nobles were expected to fight. A minor skirmish, a political squabble, or a failed alliance could end in a bloody battle, a siege, or execution. Being highborn didn't guarantee a long life. It just guaranteed a more comfortable death. The clergy offered a different kind of escape, but only for a few. If you were a peasant boy with a quick mind and some luck, you might be sent to a monastery or cathedral school. From there, you could become a monk or priest. But even the church had its hierarchies. Parish priests lived not much better than their flocks, while bishops and abbots lived like kings. And women had even fewer options. Nuns were cloistered away with little hope of advancement. For most people, life expectancy was grim. If you made it out of infancy, where death rates were astronomical, you might live into your 30s or 40s if you avoided disease, famine, and war. But old age was rare. Teeth rotted, joints failed, and injuries didn't heal properly. Without modern medicine, even minor ailments could be fatal. Arthritis, blindness, and chronic pain were common by your 30s. By 50, you were considered ancient. Disease didn't discriminate by class, but your chances of surviving it did. Nobles had access to better food, slightly cleaner environments, and rudimentary medical care. Peasants had prayer and folk remedies, neither particularly effective. When the Black Death swept through in the 14th century, it killed indiscriminately. But survival rates were slightly better among the well-fed and less crowded nobility. For the poor, the plague was a death sentence, and if life wasn't already hard enough, feudal obligations could break you. Lords demanded labor, taxes, and military service. Refusal wasn't an option. It was treason. You could be fined, have your property seized, or be thrown in jail. Peasants were expected to work the lord's land for free several days a week, in addition to managing their own plots. The system was rigged to keep you poor, tired, and desperate. Even entertainment reflected your status. Nobles had tournaments, feasts, and hunting parties. Peasants had church festivals and occasional market days. Leisure was rare, and what little free time you had was often filled with mandated religious observances. Dancing, storytelling, and simple games offered brief escapes, but these moments were fleeting and often interrupted by the demands of labor and survival. And heaven forbid you tried to break free. Runaway serfs were hunted down like criminals. Laws called villenage made it illegal for peasants to leave their lord's lands without permission. Some managed to escape to towns, where after a year and a day they could claim freedom. But the risk was immense, and many were caught and punished harshly, whipped, branded, or worse. Escape wasn't a dream. It was a near impossible gamble. In the towns and cities, things weren't much better. While merchants and craftsmen could achieve, a modest living, urban life brought its own nightmares, crowded living conditions, rampant disease, fire hazards, and poverty. Guilds controlled trade, and getting into one was difficult without connections. Most urban poor lived in squalor, not much different from the countryside, eking out a living in dangerous, unstable conditions. The church preached that your earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven, a convenient message for the ruling classes who had no intention of changing the system. Obedience was a virtue. Questioning the social order was heresy. Life was short, brutal, and utterly devoid of fairness, and the sooner you accepted that, the better your chances of surviving another day. In short, unless you were born into wealth or the church, your fate was sealed from birth. The class system wasn't just unfair, it was a death sentence disguised as divine will. You couldn't marry into money, earn your way out, or outsmart the system. Survival depended on submission, luck, and the hope that disease or famine would pass. You by this year. Spoiler, it probably wouldn't. Let's say you've somehow dodged starvation, filth, brutal laws, and the crushing weight of the class system. Congratulations, you're alive. For now. But if you get sick or injured, you're entering a whole new nightmare, medieval medicine. And spoiler alert, it was often deadlier than the disease itself. Modern healthcare may frustrate you, but compared to medieval England, it's a shining beacon of mercy and logic. First, forget about hospitals as you know them. Medieval hospitals weren't places you went to get better. They were more like almshouses for the poor and dying. If you had an illness, injury, or infection, you were better off staying home. Hospitals were filthy, overcrowded, and mostly staffed by monks or nuns whose idea of treatment involved prayer, not practical care. They were places people went to die, not to heal. Doctors? Good luck finding one. Physicians were rare, expensive, and often not very good at their jobs. Most were trained in ancient texts, Galen, Hippocrates, theories that were over 1,000 years old and based on the idea of balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they believed, was caused by an imbalance of these fluids. The solution? Bleeding, purging, and more bleeding. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for just about everything: fever, headaches, infections, even mental illness. A doctor would slice open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl, believing this would restore balance to your body. If you didn't die of blood loss, you might succumb to infection from the unsterilized instruments. Leeches were another popular tool, stuck to your skin to suck out the bad blood. It rarely worked, and often made things worse. Surgery was even more terrifying. There were no anesthetics beyond alcohol or a sharp blow to the head. No sterilization, no understanding of germs. Surgeons were often barbers by trade. Yes, the same people cutting your hair were also cutting off limbs. Amputation, done with a saw and a few strong assistants to hold you down. Infection was almost guaranteed, and without antibiotics, gangrene was a death sentence. Toothache? Get ready for medieval dentistry, if you can call it that. Teeth were yanked out with pliers or hammered out with chisels. No numbing agents, no antiseptics. Rotten teeth were common, and dental abscesses could, and did, kill people. If you were rich, you might get a fake tooth made of bone or ivory, which looked nice, but did absolutely nothing to prevent infection. And then there were the plague doctors. You've seen the beak-like masks. Those weren't just for show. They believed the plague was spread by bad air, so the beak was stuffed with herbs and spices to ward off the miasma. Treatments for the plague were a nightmare buffet. Bloodletting, lancing buboes with dirty knives, drinking potions made from crushed emeralds, or applying frogs and onions to the wounds. None of it worked. Wounds, even minor ones, were a constant. Threat. Without antiseptic, even a small cut could become infected and turn into a life-threatening abscess. Broken bones were set using wooden splints and guesswork. Surgery for internal injuries? Not a chance. Most internal injuries meant death, slow and agonizing. If you broke a leg badly, you could expect to be crippled for life, assuming you survived the inevitable infection. And let's not forget childbirth. For women, childbirth was a deadly lottery. Midwives were the primary caregivers, using herbs, prayers, and sheer willpower. If complications arose, breech births, hemorrhaging, infections, there was little they could do. Cesarean sections were almost always fatal for the mother. Infant mortality was sky high. Many women didn't survive their first childbirth, and those who did often buried half their children before reaching middle age. Mental illness wasn't treated. It was feared. People believed mental illness was caused by demonic possession or moral failing. The treatments were brutal and humiliating. Isolation, beatings, forced prayer, and in some cases, execution. There was no compassion, no understanding. If you were lucky, you were sent to a monastery for healing. If you were unlucky, you were chained up, ostracized, or worse. Common ailments had their own bizarre cures. Headaches? Apply a dead mole to your head. Fever? Drink a potion of ground pearls or take a bath in vinegar. Epilepsy? Eat the heart of a freshly killed stag. Tuberculosis? Try inhaling the smoke of burning cow dung. Most treatments were based on superstition, folklore, and trial and error guesswork. Heavy on the error, herbal remedies were popular, and some actually helped. Willow bark for pain relief, the ancestor of aspirin, and certain antiseptic. Herbs like garlic or rosemary had real benefits. But without dosages or proper preparation, they were as likely to poison you as cure you. Plus, for every useful herb, there were 10 dangerous ones being misused, like hemlock for coughs or mercury for skin diseases. If you were really unlucky, you might fall into the hands of a quack, someone pretending to have secret knowledge of cures and potions. These snake oil salesmen pushed miracle cures that usually involved dangerous chemicals, animal parts, or outright poison. One wrong diagnosis, one bad dose, and your cure would kill you faster than the disease. Religious remedies were common. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayer, fasting, and the purchase of relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, were all recommended treatments. The church taught that sickness was often a punishment for sin, so confession and penance were considered medical interventions. If you couldn't afford relics or travel, you prayed harder and hoped for divine mercy. Astrology also played a bizarre role. Many doctors consulted the stars before diagnosing or treating a patient. Certain illnesses were thought to be linked to the alignment of planets. Bloodletting, for example, was only to be done when the stars were right. It was medicine, by horoscope, and just about as effective. Public health wasn't even a concept. Streets overflowed with filth, wells were contaminated, and rats spread disease with impunity. During plagues, some towns tried quarantining the sick, but the methods were brutal, sealing entire families inside their homes to die together. Burning bodies in mass graves helped slow the spread, but understanding how disease actually worked was still centuries away. And if you somehow survived an illness or injury, congratulations, you now had a chronic condition. Crippled limbs, rotting teeth, scars, and blindness were common. There were no prosthetics beyond crude wooden limbs or iron braces, and no rehabilitation. You worked until you dropped or begged for charity, hoping not to starve before another disease or accident finished the job. The horrifying truth is that in medieval England, the best medical advice was often to do nothing and hope your body healed itself. Interference usually made things worse. And even if you survived one illness, another one was waiting around the corner. Pneumonia, dysentery, tuberculosis, typhus, all constant threats. Life was nasty, brutish, and short, and medicine only made it nastier. So if you catch a cold today and reach for a tissue or book a doctor's appointment, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. For them, illness wasn't just inconvenient. It was a death sentence delivered by the same people who claimed they were trying to save you. In medieval England, getting sick didn't just threaten your life. It handed it over to the tender mercies of ignorance, superstition, and brutality. So let's review. No hygiene, no decent food, brutal laws, a rigged class system, and medicine that could kill you faster than the disease. Life in medieval England wasn't noble or romantic. It was survival on hard mode. If the filth didn't get you, the famine justice system or a barber surgeon would. You wouldn't last a day, maybe not even an hour. So next time you complain about modern problems, just remember, you could be dodging chamber pots in the street.